For a long time, personal loans were seen as something you used only when absolutely necessary. They were a backup plan, a last resort, something you turned to when there were no other options left. Emergencies, unexpected situations, major one-time expenses, that's where personal loans belonged. But in 2026, that idea is quietly changing, because for a growing number of people, personal loans are no longer just a fallback. They're becoming part of the plan. And that shift from emergency use to everyday use is what makes this moment so important. Recent data shows that a significant portion of people now have personal loans, and more importantly, the reasons behind those loans are changing. It's not just sudden emergencies anymore. It's not just one-time situations. It's regular life. That's the difference. Because when borrowing becomes tied to everyday expenses, it stops feeling like a temporary solution. It starts feeling like a normal part of how money works. And that's where the deeper impact begins. To understand why this is happening, you have to look at how everyday costs have changed. Living expenses have gone up across the board. Housing, transportation, groceries, utilities. Everything takes a bigger portion of income than it used to. Even for people earning steady salaries, the margin between what comes in and what goes out has become thinner. And when that margin gets too tight, something has to fill the gap. That's where personal loans come in. At first, they solve a problem. They provide immediate relief. They allow you to cover something you couldn't otherwise handle all at once. They give you breathing room. And in the moment, that feels like control. But that relief comes with a shift. Because once a loan becomes part of your financial structure, it doesn't just disappear after solving the original issue. It stays. It becomes something you have to account for every single month. And over time, that monthly payment starts to feel like any other bill. Not unusual, not temporary, just normal. That's how borrowing begins to blend into everyday life. Another reason this shift is happening is because of how accessible borrowing has become. Getting a personal loan today is faster and easier than it used to be. Applications are simple, approvals are quick, funds can arrive within days, sometimes even hours. There's less friction in the process. And when something becomes easier to access, it also becomes easier to rely on. You don't need to plan as far ahead. You don't need to delay decisions. You don't need to adjust as much in the moment. Instead, you can solve the problem immediately and deal with the cost later. That convenience changes behavior, because instead of asking, "Can I afford this right now?" the question becomes, "Can I manage the payment?" And those are two very different questions. When the focus shifts to monthly payments instead of total cost, borrowing becomes easier to justify. A large expense doesn't feel as heavy when it's broken into smaller pieces. It feels manageable. It feels structured. It feels like something you can handle. But that structure can also hide the bigger picture. Because while each individual loan might feel manageable, multiple loans can start to overlap. One loan for one situation, another loan for something else, maybe a balance carried on a credit card. Each one has its own payment, each one feels reasonable on its own, but together they create a system where a portion of your income is always committed before you even begin the month. That's where pressure builds. Because once a large part of your income is already spoken for, your flexibility decreases. Your ability to adjust, to save, to respond to new situations, it all becomes more limited. And that's when borrowing starts to feel less like a solution and more like a cycle where each loan solves a short-term problem but adds to long-term pressure. There's also a psychological shift that comes with this. When people start using loans more frequently, they begin to normalize the idea of borrowing. It stops feeling like something unusual. It stops feeling like something to avoid. It becomes part of the system. And once something becomes part of the system, it's harder to question, because it doesn't stand out anymore. It blends in.
That's why this change is so important, because the risk isn't just the amount of debt, it's how people think about it. If borrowing feels normal, it doesn't trigger the same level of caution. It doesn't create the same sense of urgency. It becomes something you manage instead of something you try to eliminate. And that mindset shift can keep the cycle going longer than expected. Another layer to this is that many people aren't using loans irresponsibly. They're not making reckless decisions. They're responding to pressure. They're trying to maintain stability. They're trying to handle situations that feel necessary. That's what makes this issue more complex, because from the outside, it might look like over-borrowing, but from the inside, it often feels like adaptation. Adapting to higher costs, adapting to tighter budgets, adapting to a financial system that feels less forgiving than it used to. And in that environment, borrowing starts to feel less like a choice and more like a requirement. That's why this trend is growing, because it reflects a broader change in how money works. It reflects a situation where income alone isn't always enough to create stability, where flexibility has decreased, where unexpected costs have a bigger impact, and where people are looking for ways to bridge the gap. Personal loans have become one of those ways, but the more they're used, the more they become embedded in everyday life. And once they're embedded, they stop standing out. They become part of the background, something you plan around, something you expect, something that feels normal. That's the real shift in 2026. Personal loans are no longer just a backup plan. For many people, they've become part of the monthly system. And when borrowing becomes part of the system, the line between temporary help and long-term dependency starts to blur. Because in the end, the issue isn't just that people are borrowing more, it's that borrowing is starting to feel like a normal way to live. And that's what makes it much harder to step away from.